thanks very much for making time for me this evening. So, as Laura said, I work as a nutritionist with Tirlan. So, what we do this evening is actually just bring you through, say, like what we would find is what we're getting maximum output from cows in around, say, milk solids production in early lactation. What we'll do just at the start is, and I'm sure you've had plenty of talks from different nutritionists where we went through, say, the minutiae of, say, requirements and nutrition. But what we try to do this evening is probably make it a bit more interesting and actually go into some of the work we're actually after doing in Tirlan ourselves and basically see some of the trends that we see where we are getting solids out of farms, and we're probably more interesting where we're not getting solids out of farms as well. We'll get into some of that milk data analysis and how we can use, say, milk data analysis to identify when, say, cows are underperforming at different times of the year. And as Laura said, we'll have, for anyone that wants, there'll be quick time at the end for questions and answers. Okay. So much of early lactation nutrition can be based around body condition. And when we look at, say, that kind of critical period as we run up to calving and that kind of 60 days after calving as we head towards the breeding season, so much of that can be, the results can be seen in around body condition. Particularly, say, in around calving, we want cows in around that 3.25 of a body condition score. Now, just to make it a bit more interesting, we obviously, in my day job, we obviously get a lot of calls on people say that maybe have got this a little bit wrong. And we're probably seeing a large variety of cases there now at the moment. We're seeing an awful lot of milk fever at the minute, and that's probably coming from, say, cows who've been quite well fed at, say, the back end of last year. Milk price would have been in a good place, grass conditions were good, and a lot of cows would have been milked on with high levels of concentrate input, and that would have resulted in cows, probably being dried off and that kind of a half a body condition score ahead of what they might normally be. And it's those type of cows that we're seeing that are falling into that sort of milk fever territory there as well. Now we do have the exact, normally in years like this we would have everything to be one way or the other, but in fact we're having a fair variety of the opposite as well, where we're having cows that are calving, say, at the lower end, at a body condition of 3 and under. And what we're seeing with them is they're cows that maybe got a little bit of hardship at the back end of the year. And unfortunately, we test a lot of silage as Teagasc and many other organizations do, and we're all coming back with the same results. We're coming back with silage tests that are coming back at between 66 and 67 DMD. Now, for just a cow to be able to maintain herself, she needs that 68 DMD silage. Now, that's generally fine in the dry period, but we would have seen some instances where we would have had silages down at 62s and 61s and even below in cases. And it's those sort of herds that we were seeing low body condition scores, and it's those sort of herds that were then falling immediately into ketosis and so on and so forth as well. Okay, but probably where we're going to spend more time talking this evening or tonight about is body condition and its impact, say, on early lactation, both in output and in output of milk solids. So what is causing this loss of body condition? And it's very simply put on the screen here. Our milk yield will increase quicker in cows, specifically with the types of cows that you will have at home that have a high genetic merit for milk output. Their output will actually be higher than what the cow can physically take in. Now, we'll break it down into UFLs later on in the presentation, but that is what is causing this drop in body condition. So from the time that cow calves, her milk yield is increasing exponentially, and her intake just physically can't keep up with it. Now, you'll see later on, say, when in the work that we've done, you can see the impact of, say, poor quality silage and maybe underfeeding cows at those stages. So it's at this time that we generally are seeing this loss of body condition, okay? And there's an awful lot of very good research from all around the world, and even at home here in Ireland with Teagasc, and every single one of them come back the same. And it's irrespective of breeds, going from your Jerseys right up to your high output Holsteins. The research always says the exact same thing. From the point that we calve down, the more body condition that we lose, the harder it is to get cows back in calf. There's some research from Chagas there where they would have looked at it, where you'd actually have the body condition on this side of the graph, and you'd have the losses along here. So here's our perfect cow calving down there at just above three of a body condition score. And when we're losing less than 0.25 of a body condition score, we've 72% of those cows holding in their first service to conception in the breeding season. Now, when we go to the extreme opposite end of it, where we have cows that are calving under conditioned and we're losing half a body condition score, you can see there's only 37% of those herds actually holding their holding conception rates. So what we're seeing is, and it's like what we said, it's very easily seen that the minute that we start losing excessive body condition, it's massively impacting, say, our ability to get cows in calf. And that obviously has a knock-on effect. Us in Tirlan, we're processing milk. We will see it ourselves. For the people who are, say, consistently doing 500 and above kilos of solids, there could be different, there will always be different breeds involved in them and maybe different feeding systems and whatnot. But the one thing we will generally see all of those herds having in common is a 305-day lactation. They're getting their cows in calf on time, they're calving them down at the right time, and they're getting the full lactation out of them. If you go into your own milk recording figures, you will see yourselves heifers that are calving, say, at the right time, the 25th of January, 1st of February, whenever your calving is, they will actually produce more milk than any sort of superstar cow that might be calving on the 5th or 10th of April, simply because they just have more days in milk, okay? But how do we get days in milk? We need to get them back in calf. And to get them back in calf, we need to be feeding them right, okay? Now, when we go out on farm, it's actually very hard for someone like myself or even yourselves that are looking at cows every day. It's very hard to tell, are these cows actually dropping in body condition, okay? And there's no real accurate way of doing it. So what we would have done in, say, Tirlan a couple of years ago, because ultimately the research is there with the last 30 or 40 years, we can tell an awful lot by the about a cow's body condition and energy status ultimately by looking at their butterfat and their protein, and specifically looking at the butterfat to protein ratio. Now, you're probably thinking, what is a butterfat to protein ratio and how do you get it? Put very simply, and it is very simply, we are simply getting our butterfat, call it 4.6, and we're just dividing it by the protein, call it 3.1. That will give you a ratio of 1.48, okay? So basically, the bigger the ratio equals the bigger the gap between your butterfat and your protein. So as we see cows begin to get hungry and underfed, practically what is happening to those cows, or what do we actually see? Their butterfat is increasing and their protein is decreasing. Ultimately, why is that happening? Milk protein is very reactive to the energy we're putting into cows, and it reacts immediately. If we, even in the middle of the summer, put cows into a paddock that is, say, way too high in cover, 2,000, say, with a lot of stem and whatnot, you will see that in the milk the following day. So it's very reactive to it. So on the flip side, when we are actually underfeeding cows, specifically at the start of lactation, when our energy requirement is its highest, why is our butterfat going up? Ultimately, our butterfat is going up because that is a result of the cow being in negative energy balance, and some of the fat that cow is mobilizing, that she's pulling off of her back, is ending up in the milk. So that's why we see the gap between the two of them increasing at that stage, or the ratio going above, increasing. So where is the critical point, and where does the science tell us that the critical point is? It's in or around 1.4, that ratio. So above 1.4, we now know that the cow is beginning to, say, head into subclinical ketosis. Call it what you like, we're in negative energy balance, ketosis, hunger, whatever it is, but ultimately that is being caused by the cow's energy requirement not being met, okay? Now, within Tirlan, we would see, and we've spent a nice bit of work over the last couple of years that we'll get into in the next little while, just looking specifically at this, now we would see this, that when ratios go above 1.4, we're seeing a significant drop in milk solids, and you'll see that in some of the examples there before, okay, and later on. So what we would see there as well is this, and the science will tell us this as well, that this is where cows, her normal immune function begins to slow down, and we won't say stop, but it is definitely impacted at this stage. We will go and scan cows, say in August and September. You'll put your hand in a cow, or someone will put their hand in a cow, and they'll say, just there's cyst in her. Never came bulling, never came done anything like that. Generally, an awful lot of them are coming because we're in negative energy balance and we're ratios above 1.4. So it's very much linked to everything we don't want. Drops in milk solids production, poor fertility, reduced immune function. We were going to probably put a lot of vaccines into cows over the next while before we head into the breeding season. Cows, they're like humans. They're very, very similar. We're very similar in ways that for a vaccine to work in a human, as a cow, you need a healthy host to get the proper immune response so that you get the full 6 months or year out of that vaccine as well there, okay? So very much the summary is, when we see that ratio going above 1.4, this is where we're seeing the drops in milk solids. This is where we're seeing problems with fertility. And look, there's obviously a direct line correlation we would see as well from the people that we would see that are, say, delivering, say, 550 and above, 500 kilos of solids and above. They're spending little or no time in this category. Now, look, there's certain elements of negative energy balance that can't be avoided, but it's probably trying to limit the amount of time that we actually spend in it there as well. So look, that just, and obviously just the key takeaways in around body condition, that we're just trying to, cows that lose less than half a body condition score in the first 5 weeks after calving will ovulate 15 days earlier and reach their first service 14 days earlier than cows that lose one body condition as well. Now, that just probably gives a bit more context as to what we're going on to talk about, and probably what we'll spend the majority of our time talking about this evening, okay? And ultimately what that is about milk solids and how we actually maximize output in a very financially sustainable way as well, So why did ourselves in Tirlan, probably almost 2.5 years ago now at this stage, why did we start looking at milk solids as a kind of a project we wanted to kind of push out onto farms there? The first thing we were probably looking at is that we were having massive variability between farms. So we're having farmers up at 580, 590 and plenty above on very simple systems, on a grass, a nut, and bale silage or grass silage. And then we would also have farmers, say, that are at that probably buying the exact same amount of inputs, but are probably producing little above 300 kilos of solids. In Tirlan, for example, last year, our average kilos of solids was 411 kilos of solids for our spring calving herds. So that was the first thing we were seeing, the variability between herds. And the Teagasc Profit Monitor will reflect that as well, that we're ultimately seeing that we have an awful lot of farms with similar purchases, inputs, but their output is completely different. And it's been solely driven by obviously milk solids. We would have also found that as we'd spend a lot of time in discussion groups doing talks like this. Farmers were actually really engaged with milk solids, but they were engaged with their ICBF report, which is brilliant, but it was all 6 weeks out of date. So we'd go to a discussion group, and people would pull out their ICBF report, and they love talking about it. That I'm top 5%, I'm bottom this, I'm top that, okay? But they were talking about stuff that was all way out of date. And when we'd ask them, and someone would come to us and say, God, I had a big drop there in August, and they're coming to us in now, probably the 15th of September at this stage. And we'd ask them, like, well, why didn't you do something about it at the time? And in 99% of the cases, farmers would turn around to us and say, I actually didn't even know it was that bad, didn't realize it was actually happening. So that's why we very much, probably 2.5 years ago, our first ambition here was to be able to create a live tracker, to be able to actually demonstrate to farmers, yes, it's going right, it's going wrong, you're on target, so on and so forth. Now, that was actually in 2022 when we were having that discussion. Now, little were we know that in 23 and 24, our actual solids in 2022 would have been 435 kilos of solids per cow for our typical spring calving herd, okay? That would have obviously taken a 25 kg drop. Now, Tirlan, we're collecting milk from, say, East Cork right up into Northern Ireland. So we have a vast variety of milk suppliers. And when we actually drilled into it, when we were looking at, say, our typical spring calving herds, those spring calving herds were probably having a loss of 30 to 40 kgs of solids because they were probably a little bit more reliant on grass and probably just didn't have a plan B for when that went wrong. And unfortunately, it did go wrong in 23 and 24 there as well, okay? So that just gives the context as to why we started looking at milk solids a number of years ago. We were basically just trying to create a live tool so that it'd be able to demonstrate to farmers when it's going right and when it's going wrong, okay? We probably do 3 or 4 of these presentations every week, and we put this slide into every single one of them because it's amazing how many people have a different interpretation of how we actually calculate milk solids, okay? So for the first time, for the first thing we need to do when we're calculating our litres to kgs is we need to multiply our, say in this example, is 24 litres by 1.03. And that's just converting litres into kgs. And that gives you 24.72 kgs of milk, okay? Now, the bit that you're getting paid for and the bit you should be mostly concerned about is the butter, fat, and the protein. In this example, our protein is 3.4 and our butter fat is 4.3. So that means that 7.7% of every kg of milk that you're producing is the bit that you're actually getting paid for, okay? And the rest is just almost irrelevant to you because you're not getting paid for it, okay? So how do we actually break that down into overall kgs of solids per day? We get our 24.72 and multiply it by 0.077, and that gets us our 1.9 kgs of solids per day, okay? Just as a kind of a reference point on it, okay? So at the start of 2023, we began our mission of trying to track farmers and give them a live information. And what this would have started with is that we would have built, or I would have built, say, a tracker just on my own laptop, and we would have picked 7 farmers from around the country. Now, these are farmers, these are generally excellent farmers. They were all excellent farmers, but they were all farmers from different parts of the country that had very good figures. They measured grain, they measured grass, they measured everything. And they definitely measured their milk solids, because what we were trying to do here with these was just throw back the information to them to be able to say, look, Laura, are you producing 1.97 kgs of solids today? And Laura tell us, yeah, that's perfect. And all we were trying to do was just prove the data. Now, that was fine and it worked very well for the 7, but it's probably what we learned off the 7 at the end of 2023, where we would have seen this 25 kgs of solids of a drop, is probably the more interesting bit. So for any of the Tirlan suppliers, or you can build this at home if you even wanted yourselves, for every chart that we'll provide, there's generally always 3 lines on it, okay? We'll have your 3-year average or your last year's production. You can choose from one or the other. And what we have here, right, is our kgs of solids per day, per cow per day. And here's the different months of the year along the bottom of the screen. And here's our kgs of solids, okay? And this was one of the 7 farmers that we would have dealt with. So you can see here that this farmer, there's their 3-year average, that green line. They're an excellent farmer, so they would have been peaking in April at 2 kilos, or just over 2 kilos of solids, and in May they would have been peaking out there for the year at 2.35 kgs of solids. Now, this is someone who's excellent at grass, managing the job very well. We give everyone a target. Now, it can be 1%, 10%. We allow everyone to choose their own target. It's almost irrelevant what people want to aim for themselves, okay? And that's what that blue line is there. Now, the orange line there is actually what happened in 2023, okay? Now, you can see there, obviously, pretty line ball with February. And in March, we would have had a big drop in here. Now, in February, in March of 2023, it doesn't take a genius to work out what had actually happened there at that stage. Normally, they were doing about 1.65 kgs of solids on a 3-year average, and they would have got to only about 1.35 kg of solids. That was just mostly driven by weather, of course, and probably just didn't have the type of silage that we would have looked for when cows go back inside. Would have had that typical, what we'd find every year, 60, 67, 68 DMD silage. But this is a farmer that would have been relying on getting out to grass there at that stage. But look, did recover it very quickly and pretty much got back to where he was in any other year. Had a little blip there in June, but very much got back on track, okay? And when we'd look at that from the outside, we'd say, yeah, little blip in March, but that, look, it was hardly that bad, okay? But when we actually looked, and this is the same figures for the same farmer, okay? So we have our months along the bottom, but now we're expressing the data in a cumulative kgs of solids per cow. So you can see here, this is December. This green line, again, is the farmer's 3-year average, okay? And that's 515 kgs of solids. That is putting that farmer in our top 5% currently, okay? And when we looked at, say, where they actually ended up in December, they would have had that typical 35, I think it was 36 kilos of a loss there at that stage. And when we look at where did that gap ultimately open up, it opened up here in March, okay? And when you go back and you look and you'd say, right, well, yeah, look, we did have a bit of a blip here in March, but sure, we got back on track in April and May, and sure, grand, we should have been fine at that stage. But what we're seeing, and it's reflected, and we've a couple of more examples to demonstrate this, what we're seeing is when that gap opens up in March time there, or any stage in early lactation, it's very hard to recover that loss later on in the year. Like, look, we would have had a very difficult spring last year, the whole country would have, and we would have had, specifically in the Tirlan region, a very good back end of the year. We would have had good grazing conditions, and the market returns would have allowed farmers even just to feed on cows. So we would have had that perfect combination where we ended up with very high solids and very high production at the back end of the year. And from talking to farmers would often say, Jesus, yeah, I'll be caught up now on previous years. But the long and short of it is, we still only ended up with 411 kilos of solids when we were on track to maybe do around 400 at one stage. So it is important just to emphasize that when this loss happens in early lactation, we're losing milk solids at that stage. Now, there's obviously another negative knock-on effect on fertility and body condition, which we'll cover later on there as well, okay? Now, with this, and probably this is a big part of my own job every day, we get phone calls from around the country that would say, look, this thing is going wrong here. Can you look into it and see what's happening? In this example, this is an example with just over 500 cows. There were new entrants, and they were ultimately on paper, and their genetics were telling them that they should be doing over 500 kilos of solids. But they weren't even getting close to it. They were getting to that 470, 480, and they were having massive infertility. And probably what sparked the phone call to ourselves was that day that they scanned in, say, October, and they realized, I think it was something like 17 or 18% of the herd were empty. And they said, look, can you look into this and see what is actually going on? So the first thing we actually did in this instance is actually pulled up this farmer's butter fat to protein ratio. And this will take a minute getting used to looking at it on the screen now, but this is what you're looking at, okay, here. Now, just let's take this point right here. That's a ratio there. You can see it in April, and that's a ratio of about 1.25, okay, or 1.28, let's call it there, all right? Where we want to be, or where the ratio needs to be, is firstly below 1.4. Okay, so we want to be living in this territory. We want a ratio between 1.1 and 1.4. So that means our butter fat and our protein are not too far apart, not too close either. Okay, so this is where we want to be living. So when we look at this initially, then we can see then that, look, this farmer, when he gets to grass, it's absolutely perfect. Okay, no problem at all here. And 2023 would have been their worst performance in both solids and fertility. When we look at what happened in February and March of 2023, and here's our 1.4 line, so we don't want to be above this. they spent basically 2 months in ketosis or some form of subclinical ketosis. And you can say there then that if the herd average was about 1.45, yes, there would have been some of the cows that would have been under it, but taking the averages, we would have had cows that were well above 1.5. And the further or the bigger your ratio gets, the bigger a drop in milk solids will come. And the science and research will tell us the more likelihood is you're going to see actual clinical ketosis, and then also problems with infertility, immunity, and so on. So this was a pretty cut and dry example for ourselves to be able to go back to them and be able to say, like, look, there seems to be an energy deficit here in early lactation. Now, in fairness to them, they had excellent records, and they were actually able to break it down and say, this is what cows got on each of those days, okay? And when, from a nutritional point of view, how we'd address that is we would just go and we'd encourage all of you to maybe get a little bit more au fait with this, is actually start working out a cow's energy requirement in terms of UFLs. We have a couple of examples later. It's not that difficult to do, and to actually work out what we're putting into cows, okay? So this was pretty simple. All that we needed to do was just get more energy into the cows, okay? So we would have went down and we would have adjusted some of the diets. And look, we weren't doing anything crazy. The farmer had whole crop and he had maize silage and grass silage. We would have just increased the amount of maize silage that the farmer would have had. On the days where they would have been inside due to wet weather, we would have increased the concentrate a little bit by around 2 kilos, but we would have pulled all that out when we would have tried to get the grass as well there, okay? So again, here's our kgs of solids per day. Here's our 2 kilos. Here's the different months. And again, you can see that green line is the 3-year average that we have there. So this farmer would have been peaking just at 2 kilos of solids for the for as a 3-year average, okay? And this is the time that kind of, when we go back to the graph, that kind of February, March time was that time when they were in ketosis, when they were kind of in and out of the shed and not enough grass at that stage. So as we said, we adjusted the diet. We basically increased the amount of UFLs the cows were getting. If you boiled it all down, we increased their energy intake by around 3 UFLs. And we got the cows up to peak about 1.85 in March. And this was obviously March of last year, 2024. And we were pretty delighted with this. And we were saying, look, their normal 3-year average, they wouldn't have been even hitting 1.5. And we got them up to 1.85. At this stage, we were at the end of March, we thought, sure, Jesus, we'll be out grazing next week. And this will be absolutely fine. They'll go up and they'll do, that line should follow up there. And they'll do 2.3 kgs of solids. And this is all solved, okay? Unfortunately, it didn't work out like that. And look, it's pretty obvious why. This farmer, look, would have struggled to get out to grass. When they did get out to grass, the grass was probably a little on the heavy side, so it would have been a battle both to get the cows out on ground conditions, and the grass that we were actually getting out to was quite poor as well. And look, there was nothing we could have done, and there was nothing that farmer could have done. It was just the way that springtime was. So look, we did flatline very much. We flatlined at 1.85 right through May, and we would have had we never actually hit their 3-year average until we got into August. And look, in fairness, they would have went on after August and had a good year. But just to emphasize the point of the importance of actually feeding the cows correctly, and we were feeding the cows correctly even when they were inside and not hitting the previous year's production. Again, here is our 3-year average for kilos of solids. Here is our 480 or 485, I can't remember which one. And that's what that farmer's 3-year average would have been doing, okay? Now, when we look at what happened in March, when you remember, when we got the cows to have that little bit more of a peak at that stage and feed the cows correctly, we would have got the cows to produce a hell of a lot more. And even though in April and May and June and July, we were, when we go back to the other slide, behind our production in every one of those months, because of the good start that we had, and call it what you like, money in the bank, we had banked a lot of that solids, and that stayed. And that farmer, even at the end of July, an overall cumulative kgs of solids, which is the important figure, right? That farmer was still ahead at that stage. And that farmer at the end of that, end of 2024, ended up ahead of their 3-year average. And you have to remember, 3-year average has 21 and 22 in it, which are 2 very good years. Those were the years where we were doing 435 kgs of solids, okay? So it was an excellent performance from our perspective. but very much emphasize the point to ourselves, the importance of early lactation nutrition. Now, when we go back to that farmer and we say, Jesus, you got 35 kilos more than if you were following the trend of people in your locality or our typical spring calf and herd. That farmer is saying, yeah, that's grand, but it's actually my 8% empty rate is the bit that I'm happy with. And it's very much that, and we're seeing with this farmer now, because we avoided, say, this negative energy balance at this stage here, the cows were able to cycle better. And the science backs that up fully as well, that the cows were able to, they were never short of energy. It was a difficult year, but they weren't short on energy. Allowed them to cycle properly, go back in calf. And that's what we would see when we look at herds, say, that are producing high levels of solids consistently. They're always getting cows back in calf and getting them in a nice tight 6-week calving interval, like what I was saying earlier on, to get that 3 or 5 day lactation there as well. And we're probably emphasizing this point now even further, but this again is another completely separate farmer. Farmer again, here's our 22 kgs of solids, here's our 23 and our 24 through the different months, okay? And you can see here in 2022, this farmer was doing 511 kgs of solids. Excellent performance. Again, putting them in our top, putting that farmer in our top 5%. But obviously, they would have followed the trend that so many other people did as well. And in 2023, they would have fallen to 474 kgs of solids. And last year, they would have fallen to 440. And again, where did this drop take place? Grand, everything worked perfectly in 2022, okay? And to demonstrate this, I've highlighted April here. And here's the different amount, like in April in 2022, this farmer, his average cow produced 130 kgs or was at 130 kgs of solids produced by the end of April. Now, to break that down into kgs per day, that's 2.3 kgs of solids per day in April. Now, April of 2022 was an excellent month. We had plenty of grass, plenty of energy going into cows, okay? April of 2023, this farmer, and if you remember what April of 23 was like, we came out of a difficult March, and the first that week, 10 days of April were quite difficult, but the month cleared up very quickly. And that farmer would have done 1.9 kgs of solids in that instance. And then in 2024, needn't we be reminded, but that farmer would have struggled to get out at all. And when they did get out, the grass was obviously in quite a poor state. And that reflected in the kilos of solids there as well. And that is when the farmer would have been given 1.6 kgs of solids. Now, why we put this slide into any of the presentations we do, we often, after a bad spring, we see an awful lot of farmers and tell us the year is ruined, it's gone, I might as well pull the plug on them and put tubes in them. And just to emphasize why that is actually wrong, okay, I've highlighted here in September where this farmer, again, we've just highlighted the kgs of solids. And you can see there in 23 and 24, those cows were doing 1.8 kgs of solid. They were actually doing more solids than what they were doing in April in some of the months. So it just does go to demonstrate when we get the thing back on track, and that is mostly driven by getting grass back, right? That we can get cows to deliver even after a bad start. But unfortunately, when this loss happens early in lactation, it is pretty much baked in for a large part of it is baked in for the remainder of the year. Now, just to demonstrate this is the same farmer that you're just after seeing on this slide here. And I've just put the farmer's milk protein. So these are the different weeks of the year. And this red box represents April here. And the different colors you're seeing, let's just follow this 2023, for example, is the yellow. That's that going along there. And here's our protein, okay? So this farmer would have started there 3.7, 3.6 protein, excellent protein, right? All during, and that was February into March. Now, if you remember what happened in February 23, farmers were out grazing day and night. It was excellent. Johnstown Castle, I think, only had like 6 or 7 mil of rain for the whole month. It was phenomenal weather. And ultimately, that is reflected in that farmer's protein there at that stage, all right? And what obviously the big drop here is when the herd went in. But the bit we'd like to get people to emphasize, right? When the cow is taking in the right amount of energy, like she did in 22 and 21, that green and blue line there, right? we had protein up on 3.6. Now this, when you remember back, this is when the farmer was doing 2.3 kgs of solids here. Down here is when we're doing 1.6 and 1.9. So it's reflected in proteins there as well. But look, proteins, because they can be different between breeds, they're not an overall, they're a good indication, but they're not as accurate as telling us as the butter fat to protein ratios can give us when we look at how what performance is happening on farm there. Because the joy of the butter fat to protein ratio, it takes that breed discrepancy largely out of it, and it gives you just a good indication whether you've a Jersey or a Holstein. We can still use that equation, dividing the protein by the butter fat to get our ratio, okay? We can see here in this farmer, the same one you were just looking at, here's our 1.4 line. So we don't want to be above here, okay? Where we want to be is here. So what's happening in this farm and so many other farms around the country, in early lactation, we are crossing this line, okay? Now, there's some of that can't be avoided, right? But there's also some of it that can be limited. And to demonstrate that, in February 2023, here's our ratio, 1.2 to 1.3, absolutely ideal. When that farmer was out grazing and getting plenty of energy into cows, there was no problem. But this is the same herd, just 2 different years, same management, okay? And this is the difference between them. Now, when we go back and look at, say, the correlation between butter fat to protein ratios and the actual amount of solids we're delivering, we go back to our 2022 here, this green line, where we would have had cows that would have been producing 2.3 kgs of solids on this herd. You can see their ratio, 1.2, absolutely perfect, okay? 2023, we were doing 1.9 kgs of solids. You can see here, we came into the month well above 1.4, but when we got back out to grass, very quickly dropped our ratio down here, okay? And that's when we were doing 1.6 kgs. And we were doing more solids when we were down here than up there. When we look at 24, the ratio that is actually, sorry, 2024, when we were doing 1.6 kgs of solids, you can see here that this is when they spent the most amount of time in that negative energy balance, ketosis, call it negative ratio above 1.4, call it what you like. So again, it directly correlates with the amount of time we're spending up here to the amount of solids that we're actually collecting on farm. And there's obviously, when we go out and speak to these farmers, there is always seem to be a correlation with fertility as well, that we're having our best fertility results when we're down here, and our worst fertility results the longer time we spent above there as well, okay? So with all that, we've obviously at this stage well established that we are short on energy at different times of the year. And people would often ring us up and would ask us, said, well, how much nuts should I be feeding? What should I be feeding? Or can I cut them out, or can we do this? And what we'd like to get people to a stage where we'd almost try to get everyone to understand what their actual requirement for energy is. And how we measure energy in Ireland is through UFLs. So 1 UFL is a kilo of barley, okay? So what we would see here, and what we, just as a reference, and we'll go through some of the other UFLs and the feeds that we have, all right? But for every cow, the same as ourselves, we need a maintenance requirement. We mightn't be producing milk, but we'll still have to go and get something to eat this evening to keep the lights on, get up, do our exercise, go to work, whatever. Cows are the exact same. Cows need about 6 UFLs for that maintenance. If she wasn't producing any milk, she'd still need that 6 UFLs. So that's what we always start with, our 6 UFLs for maintenance. And then for basically every litre we produce, that we need about half a UFL. It's a little bit closer to 0.45 UFLs for every litre we produce. So in this example where we have 28 cow producing 28 litres, that cow requires 12.6 UFLs for milk production, okay? So how do we get the overall requirement? We add our maintenance, we add our milk requirement, and that gives us a total UFL requirement of 18.6 UFLs. Now, so many of you will have cows that will be closer to 38 litres. That calculation will be exactly the same. But what you will be seeing is that your figure will be up on 22 and 23 UFLs, okay? So before we answer any questions on to say, how much feed should I be feeding? We'd always break it actually down to say, how much energy are you giving them and how much energy do they actually require, okay? And you'll get to see why that's important in a little while. So our grazed grass on a dry matter basis, that's got a UFL roughly of 1 there, or 1.05 in springtime. Good quality grass silage, and this is scarce. As we said, we've tested an awful lot of silage, and the silage we have tested so far is on average between 66 and 68 DMD. What we're calling good quality silage is that 74 to 75 DMD, which equates to 0.84, 0.82 UFLs, okay? Now, our average quality silage, or the type of silage that we generally have ourselves at the moment, that's 0.76, 0.75, 3/4 of a UFL, okay? Our maize silage, 30% starch is 0.85, and our concentrate is between 0.9 and 0.95 there at that stage, okay? So let's look at some actual typical diets that we actually see that are the most common out there, okay? And what actual UFLs they're supplying, and what energy what milk they're actually supporting there as well. So here is probably what we call our February of 23 diet, right? Where we're out grazing day and night, and where it's absolutely perfect conditions. Now, there's an important point to be made here, that this is assuming that the grass is actually dry, okay? Because you'll understand why that's important now in a while. So in those dry conditions of the perfect grazing, that 14, 15 hundredths of a cover, those cows can take in 15, 16 kgs dry matter, no problem at all. So that has a UFL of 1. We're taking in 15.5 kilos of it with 15.5 UFLs. Put 3 kilos of concentrate on it, we're now all of a sudden up at that 19 UFLs. Our requirement for 28 litres is that 18.5. This here, on this side of the screen, this is what 2.2, 2.3 kgs of solids and a cow going back and calf looks like, okay? Now, granted, we can't have that every day of the year, and we definitely haven't had it over the last couple of years. So on the right-hand side of the screen, as you look at it there, this is probably the more typical diet that we do see when we're forced back inside, okay? This is where we go back inside on 68 DMD silage, and we will up the concentrate to 5 kilos, okay? Now, from the mindset of some of the farmers we deal with, they'll say, sure, Jesus, I've upped the feeding to 5 kilos, and they have as much silage as they want. But unfortunately, when you actually do the figures on that, that is supplying only 13.7 UFLs. That is supplying enough energy for about 16 to 18 litres of milk, okay? Now, when we say that to people will say, no, they never go down that low. Yeah, because look, and yourselves as a group, you will have cows that are exceptionally well bred, and whether you feed them or not, they're going to supply an awful lot of milk. So what ends up happening in this instance is that we actually end up producing probably 23 or 24 litres, but we're only putting enough energy in for about 18 litres, 16 to 18 litres. Where's the rest coming off of? It's coming off their back. And that's what is slipping us into that negative energy balance at that stage then as well, okay? Now, when we go through that with people will say, it can't be, sure. Like, they have as much silage as they want. They are never without silage. And we never doubt that, and they aren't. But the problem with silage is physically, they can't take in as much as what they can with grass. So just to be clear on that, silage, they will struggle to take in much more than 12 kgs of dry matter. Over here, we were taking in 15, 16, and no problem at all. But because of the nature of silage, and it's not as palatable and a number of things, we struggle to see cows taking in more than, say, that 12 kgs of dry matter. So now we're taking in about 20 to 25% less kgs of dry matter, and that the amount we're taking in also has 25% less energy. So we're losing two ways. We're losing on intakes, and we're losing on energy content as well, okay? And at that stage then, like that grass silage there, that 12 kilos, that's only delivering about 9.5 UFLs, where our grass over here was delivering 15.5, okay? And the 5 kilos of concentrate, yes, it's an extra probably 2 UFLs, but it's still not even coming close to making up the gap there as well, okay? Now, look, if you added maize silage into this diet or different things like that, it would, of course, help it. Just through intakes, if nothing else alone, and we can go through that later on if anyone wants to go through some examples as well. The next two diets that we want to actually go through there is, you'll often see, say, the likes of myself on webinars and different occasions out trying to get people to put a strip wire up and get out to grass, you know, and probably it's a little bit lost at times, and people think that they're just doing it to tick a box and they're doing it to hit a graze and target and be able to stand up a discussion group and say, oh, I have them out, all right, no problem at all here. But like, realistically, from a nutritional point of view, what we are actually trying to do is get more UFLs into them, okay? And getting the cows out for that, say, 4 or 5 hours, and they'll take in, as a rough rule of thumb now, and it's pretty handy to use. For every hour that you can get cows out, you're getting in 1 kilo of dry matter, okay? So what we would see there in these times then, that if we can, say, feed our 5 or 6 kilos, get out to grass for 5 or 6 hours, and feed them silage then when they're inside, we're bringing that diet up to 17.3 UFLs. Now, when we look back on our previous one where we just had them locked in full time, we were only there's a massive increase in the amount of UFLs that we're delivering just by getting them out to grass for a little while. And I do think personally that point is lost on people at times, that it is actually increasing the amount of energy that we're getting into cows and avoiding that negative energy balance and supporting the milk production, okay? But look, we can't be silly now either. We obviously understood, like, we were just only looking back there, it was the 26th of March where we would have held the first of 2 or if not 3 pretty much crisis webinars on fodder availability last year. And at that stage, we would have happily taken any amount of silage at any quantity as well, or any quality as well. So for those instances where we are stuck inside and we can't get out, just to give you an idea of the amount of energy that is required, you would have to be getting up and feeding around 8.5 kilos of concentrate with 68 DMD silage to be able to deliver, say, 16 UFLs, okay? And unfortunately, that is actually what is actually required to deliver the right amount of energy in those instances, okay? Now, the point, and we often get criticized to say, of course, you're telling us to sell feed, you're the one selling it. What we would see on this and long term, that and it's very evident to see long term where this goes, right? If we can increase silage quality in these instances and bring our 68 up to a 74 or 75 DMD, we would be able to cut that 1.5 kilos, nearly 2 kilos of concentrate out of this equation, okay? And deliver the same amount of energy. So for anyone that thinks that this is all about concentrate, this starts at silage quality for the times that we actually are struggling to get out to grass, okay? I just wanted to put in a couple of slides on probably almost common misconceptions or where we see drops in production, okay? And specifically with the type of cows that you will all have at home, you have a decent sized cow, a good cow, right? We do see it very often. We are under allocating these cows grass, specifically when we're on say a 12-hour kind of strip wires, okay? We will often see production dropping as we get into when people start putting up strip wires. They'll be measuring their grass, they'll be doing everything that they should be doing and saying, I'm after allocating her, say, her 16 kilos and I'm giving her 16 kilos dry matter. And yeah, that's what is telling me she should have enough there. I do think, and when you go home and look at, say, what intake some of your cows are actually capable of taking in, we are completely underestimating these cows, calling it 18 kilos dry matter. I would safely say that many of your cows are 20 and well above it, specifically when we're putting the right forages ahead of them, okay? How would we solve this in an awful lot of instances? We just get people to actually go to 24 or 36-hour paddock breaks. And Chag has done a lot of good research there over the last couple of years in Moore Park, where they would have run different groups of cows, different herds, say, on a 12-hour strip wire and then on a 36-hour breaks as well. And what they were finding is that your heifers were suffering a lot more in your 12-hour strip wires because they were never getting that stage where they could just absolutely fill themselves and gorge themselves on grass at those times. A very typical one we see as well is wet weather. Like, and it's a bit mad, like the first conversation we'll have with everyone is the weather. Everyone knows that there's something like 9 or 10 mil of rain coming for Ireland this Saturday, but how many of us will actually adjust to feeding for cows? Because cows only have so much space in their rumen to be able to be filled up, okay? And that is generally in around that kind of in 85 to 100 kgs of intake, all right, of fresh weight. Now, that's fine when the grass, and you can see it down here, when we've grass at a dry matter of 18%, which grass probably wasn't far off on a day like today, a lovely fine day, right? That cow is having to take in 89 kgs of fresh weight. Now, that's capable. She can do that no problem at all to get her 16 kgs dry matter intake. Now, on a wet day, when the dry matter of grass, or a wet few days, when the dry matter of grass is down at 12.5%, okay, that same cow, to get the same 16 kgs, is having to take in 133 kgs. Physically, they just cannot do it. So in those instances, we need to be introducing some additional fodder in the form of high dry matter forage, extra concentrate, whatever it may be, but we need to be able to increase that intakes on those days, because so many of our own factories, they will see rain coming and they will immediately associate it with a drop in milk supply, and it's simply because of what is happening here. We physically cannot get enough grass into cows in those times as well. All right. Now, look, we won't focus too much on Tirlan here now, but because I know there's members from all over the country, but what we're doing to try and solve this and to try and make people more aware of it is we have our milk solids tracker that's available for all of our suppliers through Tirlan Farm Life, and there's an app coming later in the year for it. And all we're trying to do with this is to be able to just emphasize to people when it's going right, when it's going wrong, like what you saw on those graphs there earlier on as well. We have taken on, say, 4 nutritionists that are, say, in our 4 regions, our north, south, east, and west. And what these nutritionists are doing is they're going out on farm, because look, it's maybe only half interest in looking at something like this when it's someone else's figures. But when some of our own nutritionists actually get out on farm and we're actually able to point out, look, here is your figures and this is what's happening on your farm. Because generally what we're seeing is when it's happening one year, it is generally happening most years. So it's being able to use them nutritionists who have all of the data from the milk processing to be able to identify where we can actually try and improve it there as well, okay? And for any of the Tirlan suppliers, we're actually after starting to text our suppliers in the last 3 weeks any time that their butter fat to protein ratio goes above 1.4, okay? So what we're doing here on twice a week, on a Monday and a Thursday, we're sitting down with some of our analysts, and they're running it up. Well, they're running it automatically now at this stage, and they'll analyze all the milk over the last 7 days. So they would have done that this morning. They would have taken all the milk from every supplier individually and looked at the butter fat to protein ratio. And anyone that would have been above 1.4 would have got a text just to say, look, your butter fat to protein ratio has crossed 1.4, could be an indication of underfeeding. Contact some of our nutritionists if they need to be able to talk about it. Very much we see this as a long-term project, and I think the industry, and we've engaged a good bit with Teagasc and different stakeholders on it, and this has to be a very long-term vision, and that's why we probably are very much focusing just probably in 2 immediate actions here, solve this year, but also probably put a plan in place to make to solve the long-term trends and to be better 5 years down the line from that. And the 2 key cornerstones of that are both soil nutrition and increased silage quality as well. Because if we can increase soil nutrition, we're going to grow more grass. We're going to grow better grass. We're going to grow grass that won't go to stem as quickly. And then obviously, say if we're able to increase silage quality, which we will have to at this stage, it's going to do a number of things. It's going to increase the amount of output we have in the springtime. It gives us a lot more flexibility when the weather is going wrong. And look, we need to accept that the science is telling us that the weather patterns have changed. And what we're to expect is longer periods of extremes. Now, that could be longer periods of dry, longer periods of wet, longer periods cold, whatever it might be. But we are to expect them, and that is the way it's going to be going forward. And unfortunately, over the last 2 years, we have grown more grass in the second half of the year than we have in the first half of the year, which is a complete flip from what we have been normally used to as well. Okay, so so that's very much why we're looking at, say, trying to increase silage quality as well. Okay. So that's just a quick run around of what we think is important of, say, early lactation nutrition and what we're doing in Tirlan to try and help suppliers to just make more informed decisions. And would you like to take any photos from anyone, or questions from anyone?
That was great, Brian. Thanks so much. Sure, if anyone has any questions, just unmute yourselves. That was really fascinating.
Oliver, yep, you can unmute yourself there if you can.
Yeah, great presentation, Brian. Now, I just wanted to ask you, what does the app do exactly?
So we probably, it's not on an app yet. It's on the Tirlan Farm Life website under the My Farm section, okay? And look, Oliver, we probably have kept it pretty limited at the moment. All that we do have on it at the minute is basically that graph, your kgs of solids per day, and your cumulative kgs of solids, okay? Now, eventually, because look, some of the feedback, we would have launched it last September at our Ballyragget Open Day, and we were probably taken aback at the response we got from it. But the one bit of negative we were getting was saying, Jesus, it's an awful pain if I can go into the website every time that I need to log into it. So that's why we're putting it onto an app. And we hope to have, say, a lot of our butter fat to protein ratios and our, say, even our protein charts and stuff like that on it there as well. But for the moment, what we have there is on the website there at the moment in the milk solids tracker is your cumulative kgs of solids graph and your kgs of solids per cow per day. And it also gives you a quick summary of like what solids you've done over the last number of years. And like we ask you what your cow numbers are. We know what milk solids we've bought off you. So if you tell us that you have 100 cows over the last 4 years, we'll just simply go and divide that 100 into the amount of milk solids we've bought off you. It's fairly straightforward. And just a note on that, because it's a question we're probably getting 10 times a day at the moment. Farmers you'll be asked in the app to say enter your 2025 cow numbers, and loads of people will come back to us and say, well, I'm planning on milking 100, but I only have 70 of them calved. Should I put in 70 or should I put in 100? We want you to put in your 100, okay? And why that is a couple of reasons. One, because we're dividing 100 into your February and March milk supplies in the other months, right? But we very much more so have purposely done it this way to demonstrate, even for this farmer, right? This farmer here, he went from 18% empty rate with a poor 6-week calving interval to a 8% empty, 8 or 9% empty rate, and it tightened up his 6-week calving interval. So if we done nothing else, only just feed the cows the exact same as what we did last year, because he has more cows calving earlier on in lactation, you'll see his February and March kgs of solids a lot higher than previous years, simply because he's more cows calved.
Yes. Now, is there an easy way to calculate just with the app or using some spreadsheet or some simple formula, how much concentrates to feed a particular cow? So, for example, if you had a cow giving 30 litres of milk, is there some very simple way to how to feed that cow, we'll say on 3 different diets. Number 1 diet, silage. Number 2 diet, wet grass. Number 3 diet, dry grass, for example.
Yeah, and that's ultimately what our, say, nutritionists do. Generally, when our lads are leaving a yard, they'll generally give 3 different diets, Oliver, specifically at this time of the year. We have an outgrazing full-time diet. We have almost 4 diets, actually. You'd be outgrazing full-time, and that's the simple one. You'd have the outgrazing for 6 hours, and then we'd have like what we call a 10 kg buffer, where we have the cows in, where the cows are out mostly, but they're just maybe coming in for an hour either side of milking, just to get a little bit of a buffer at that stage then. And then the final one is in full time. It's probably, it's very easy to do, Oliver, but it's probably, it's very farm specific, because some farmers will tell us that, look, I have a diet feeder, I want to put some through the diet this way, that way. But it'd be pretty simple if you just look at even that example on the screen. If you can actually allocate, say, the cow to take in 16 kgs of dry matter, like even in perfect conditions now, like feeding 4 or 5 kgs of concentrate, as long as the grass is dry, is going to support that 30 plus litres.
Sorry, and I'll just ask you one more question, because I know other people have to get in there. But you know, if you have, would you recommend feeding a different diet to cows and heifers? Like, let's say your heifers are given, you know, a lower amount of milk, and the cows, you know, and you could have cows in different lactations given higher amounts of milk. Do you recommend just giving an average, or you know, depending on what your herd is giving, or would you prefer to feed to yield?
Look, probably that dictates what facilities are actually on farm. Generally, what we would be seeing for our typical spring calving herd, they're all generally calving at the same time, so they will have this a pretty similar requirement. Okay. Now, just getting, say, if there was a feed to yield option, then naturally enough you're going to go for that option. But look, we have to deal with the facilities that we have on farm, and look, not everyone has feed to yield systems. In those instances, we would be feeding generally to slightly above the average. Okay. Now, we would always try and facilitate as many cows as possible in that. And it just, where do you want that to end up, really, was the question we'd ask you. Do you want to feed your top cow that could be doing 37, 38 and above litres, right? But that cow that's given 24 litres is getting way too much energy at that stage, and she's realistically not doing anything with it at that stage. One point I would make on heifers, right, is yes, we can go to this slide here and work out what she's given 22 or 24 litres. We'll feed her for that. Heifers are still growing into their second lactation, and you could safely add a UFL to every heifer you have every day, simply on that for that as well. So we generally would see it's the consequences of overfeeding some of the poorer performers. They're getting a little bit more heavily fed, but if we go the opposite way and underfeed as a group, we generally make our better, higher producing cows suffer in those instances. A very hard one, Oliver, to do, specifically when you have split calving herds as well.
Fair enough. Okay, thanks for that, Bryan.
No problem. So there's a question from Tom in the chat there. I'll just call it out for everyone. Would you recommend a pre-calving diet to allow easy transition to higher levels of concentrate? Yes, is the simple answer. It's not always practical, right? But if we go and we learn from, say, colleagues out on the continent and in America, where they really will focus on high output. Now, we're not saying that we advocate that, but there's a lot of learnings of how they actually approach nutrition on it, okay? And ultimately what they're doing, they're introducing a little bit of concentrate. Now, we're talking like a kilo and a half of concentrate in that run up to calving. Now, like, you kind of would want it in around minimum 10 days beforehand, all right? And generally what that is doing, you're you're basically introducing concentrates back into the cow is the first thing, all right? So cows, their stomachs are not like us. Their stomach is a big fermentation vat where we've loads of bugs living in it, right? And there's a different bug to break down everything differently, okay? So there'll be a bug to break down beet, there'll be a bug to break down grass, silage, concentrate. What you're doing when you're introducing that little bit of concentrate in the run-up to calving, you're basically re-establishing that population of microbes that break down starch and concentrate, right? So that when the cow lands back into the parlour, she's in a lot better position to be able to take in concentrates. It's something we're seeing far becoming way more common, even in our maybe our more typical spring calving herds that wouldn't have a diet feeder, that previously wouldn't have done it, because they realize that they're going to have to get up and start feeding decent amounts of concentrate, call it 5-6 kilos and maybe above, depending on the situation. And if we have a cow that has not seen any concentrate maybe since the 5th of December, and we land her into a parlour after going through the stress of calving, after all that hardship, maybe not after eating properly, and we land her in and give her 3 kilos this evening and 3 kilos in the morning, it is very quickly going to, can very quickly lead into problems. That's why we very much do see it working well. We would see it, silage quality has been quite poor over the last couple of years. And at the start of every kind of January or February, when people start calving, we'll get a panicked phone call to say, Jenny, the cows have very poor colostrum. Can we do anything with it? Do I need to feed more minerals? And generally, by feeding a kind of a 16, 17% kind of ration, nut, whatever, to those cows, you'll immediately increase this colostrum quality. So you're conditioning their rumen, but you're also increasing colostrum quality. Where we really find it helps is specifically now, where you will have 70% of the cows calved, okay? And they'll be in the parlour, they'll be on their 6, 7, 8 kilos of concentrate. Cow calves today, and she's just thrown in with the rest of them. And sure, like, you might have someone milking, they mightn't recognize freshly calved cows. You might make the mistake yourself. And if she gets a lot of concentrate, you're running the risk of it. But if we're after introducing her to a bit of it before, it very much does help there in those instances. One thing to just note on it, ideally, you do want concentrate that doesn't have any, say, minerals, specifically calcium, in it, because obviously in the dry period we're trying to almost starve the cow of calcium, and it just defeat the purpose if we're putting it in, like we'd add calcium into our beef, our dairy nuts, all our feeds as all millers will. You ideally want a feed that has no minerals in it to avoid any sort of risk with that.
Any more questions?
Bryan, what's your thoughts on adding like a glycerin or any of them type products in for them fresh cows?
Yeah, it does help, James. We find it, and look, ultimately what you're doing with when for those, I presume what you're talking, those drinks straight after calving, you're just adding glucose back into the cow, you're adding electrolytes. It is a help. It is a help, no doubt at all there. And look, a good point, like, again, when we look at, say, other parts of the world, how do they treat freshly calved cows? You'll often actually see them drenching cows with exactly what you're saying, but they'll actually drench the cow with maybe 25, 30 litres of a drench. And people will often think that, Jesus, that's great, you're getting all the electrolytes from it and all like that. But actually what you're actually doing is you're putting like 25, if you're putting 20 litres into them, you're putting 20 kilos of a weight into the bottom of the rumen. And that avoids an awful lot, that can help avoid an awful lot of your twisted guts and twisted guts at that stage. Because immediately what's after happening, you have a calf after coming after exiting this gap, and it's created this gap. And this is when you can have your rumen and your abomasums falling around and get twisted. So what you can do to try help that, and I do think that a lot of those drinks are that's a lot of value of them. You're immediately putting a weight down in the rumen to avoid that happening. There's a question in the chat there again. In heavier types of land areas where cutting silage dates are difficult, would you say maize is a good alternative to having good forage on the farm for post-calving? Very quickly, yes. We would like maize for a number of reasons. Okay, if we say offered a cow good quality silage, right, 75 DMD silage, she probably will actually take in a little bit more than the 12 kilos. You might get her up to 12 and a half. You might even get her to 13 kilos dry matter intake. All right, that's a good quality silage. Now, if you offered that good quality silage and then you came along and offered her maize right beside it, she'll eat both of them and her overall intake will go up. It'll go up that extra couple of kilos. So instead of getting, say, 12 or 13 kgs of dry matter intake from forage, we're now getting her up to 14, 15 kgs of constant, 14, 15 kgs of dry matter intake. So you're physically now taking in more feed. And this is not to be underestimated. If we can get cows just to take in a couple of kilos more of actual intake into them, well, sure, we're adding extra UFLs into them straight away, so we are. So that is massively driving the intakes of it as well. So, and again, that's the first part of it. So why is maize quite good, say, in grazing situations? So if you came to us and said, right, I want to formulate a feed that's going to complement wet grass, that can buffer feed quickly, that they can take in a big quantity of it, that's palatable, we'd probably come back to you with something very similar to maize silage. Like, it's palatable, it's high in dry matter, they'll take in a decent quantity of it very quickly, and probably most importantly, the starch in it is a bypass starch, okay? So what does that ultimately mean? So if we have, say, our rumen that is where all the majority of digestion takes place, this is where the grass gets broken down and everything comes in here basically first, pretty much, right? And this is where our acidosis happens. This is where our scour happens, all right? And what causes an awful lot of that is readily digestible energy, like grass, like things like beets and maybe even rolled wheat or something like that. Basically comes into rumen and just drops all of its energy very, very quickly. That's what grass does. So ideally, to complement grass, we almost want something that does the opposite of it. And that's what maize does. Maize comes in and releases its energy very slowly. And it doesn't even release all of its energy in the rumen. It actually, that's why it's called a bypass starch. It bypasses the rumen, and the rest of it's broken down outside of the rumen. So that's why it's very safe to be able to do it in those instances. And that's why you never see people ringing to say, God, the cows came in, they got a whole heap of maize, and now they're sick. It just doesn't happen. And that's why it is. It's very, very safe. If that answers your question. There's one in there as well on your opinion on whole crop on milk yield. Whole crop is it works quite well. It works quite well. There's probably, we've seen over the last couple of years a bit of variability in the testing of it, but as long as you're actually making it properly, sealing it properly, what we do tend to find in some of the poorer crops is that we end up with a lot of straw and not a lot of grain. And like, look, that can at times when we're trying to fill this gap with energy, if we've something with a high level of straw, grand is bringing fiber for ruminants, which is essential, but we're maybe at times struggling to get the right amount of grain into them. And unfortunately, as well, at times, if we're talking whole crop, we're generally talking wheat or barley or triticale, and the way that can act at times, it's a little bit dissimilar to maize, that energy, that starch that's in the whole crop, it can come in and be released very, very quickly in the rumen. So that's when you can actually see cows get a little bit loose. But overall, it's far more positive than what it has negatives. Can maize be fed straight with no silage in instances of no diet feeder on farm? Absolutely no problem at all. We were on a farm in Clonmel where they're out grazing. They're out grazing for the day. They get out for an hour after milking, and they're coming back into solely maize, simply because that farmer was running out of grass silage, and the grass silage he had wanted to be kept for dry cows and different animals around the place. We did adjust the protein in the nut because obviously maize generally comes in at, say, maize silage comes in at, say, 7-8% protein. So it's specifically when you don't have a lot of grass in the diet, because grass is supplying an awful lot of the protein, we generally would up the protein in the nut a little bit. But like in that instance, like we were getting out grass, we were only on an 18% nut. There wasn't anything drastic happening there at all, like, you know. And it probably is an awful common question that we would get at this time of the year is how much what protein should I have in the nut? Like if we solved our energy deficiency in Ireland and we've solved our protein deficiency in Ireland, our best bang for buck and our best return would be solving the energy requirement. We're generally can see that we can that protein is definitely not as important as energy, and that's very much shown, say, in our butter fat to protein ratios at times. Like, look, in parts of the world where you'll have very high output cows, you will often see that they will actually slightly restrict the protein in some of the diets, and all that'll do is just keep the liters a little bit under control, but it'll allow the cow to put a little bit more energy into her own body condition. So it's far more dangerous to be continuously under allocating energy as opposed to protein. And look, we're in a grazing system, so we're never too far away from protein anyway.
Any more questions before we wrap things up?
There's one in there on the view on sugar beet. Again, excellent feed. Like it's one of the feeds that when you look at on like a UFL basis, right, it's one of the highest you can actually get there as well. That's the benefit of it. What we would see there as well is that we could set up a diet absolutely perfectly and they'd be absolutely humming on it. We'd have them up to 21, 22 kgs dry matter intake. And if we added, say, 8 kgs fresh of beet, which is around 2 kgs, 1.8, 2 kgs dry matter, the cows will actually go to that next level of energy overall intake with that. Beet is a great feed like that, specifically if we have it in over a long period of time. Where some of the negatives could be, because we obviously have to give context in this, we will probably get a bit of rain now at the weekend. And we could have cows that have been out grazing day and night, and people had said, right, I'm going to get out now and graze as much as I can. And maybe the beet that you were feeding is now out of that diet, okay? And if we bring the cows in after a wet day's grass and we then feed them something with, like I'm talking like 10 kilos beet in it, we are running the risk of making those cows loose at that stage. And why is it? When we come back to our rumen here, it's basically one of the things that rivals grass with how quickly it releases energy, so it'll come into the rumen and just drop its energy straight away. Now that's a positive in one sense, but for freshly calved cows in and out of grass, it can cause trouble at times, but it can be absolutely safely done and perfectly done once you actually once you have it balanced, and we actually formulate diets to be able to do it. And it's very easy to do. You do it with straw. You do it with putting in more digestible fibers like your peat pulps and stuff like that are still very high in energy, but it's just to be able to balance it. But it's probably one of those feeds we do get the most amount of calls at this stage of the year, with seeing a little bits of upsets at that time of the year, specifically because, and yeah, when cows come back in off of wet grass, haven't seen beat in a little while, and then all of a sudden it's Jenny, God, this stuff is lovely, and they do love it and they'll seek it out. But it can cause trouble at times, but it can definitely be built into a diet. We just need to do it safely.
Great. I'd say we have time for one more question, if there's one more question out there.
Right, just in terms of your Northern Irish player, what's the solids output like from up there, and what are they doing different to the south?
Yeah, so we do have a good share of suppliers up there. It's probably quite a different system. It's probably quite a different system up there. They're probably a higher input, higher output. But saying that, like, look, we're even recently, after getting an awful lot of suppliers up there that are actually out grazing as well a good bit. So like, look, it's two very different systems, and you don't even have to go to Northern Ireland to find it. Like, I'm up in Louth tomorrow, and even there in parts of Meath, you'll just see a very different type of system at times there. But again, when it boils down to it, you're ultimately still focusing on the same thing. You're still focusing on getting the absolute best quality silage and forage into those cows. Maybe they're in longer than what we might have, say down in the south of our regions, but it's the fundamentals are still always the same. We often find that, I think some people down south think that they're just up there pumping in feed, like irrespective, and not focusing on the quality of forages going in. But I'd say we probably see a massive emphasis on forage quality up there, and they're very successful at it.
That's great. Thanks so much, Bryan, and thanks everyone for joining as well. I think that was a really, really successful webinar. I think everyone got a lot out of it. So I have recorded this, and it'll be going up on our YouTube channel. So everyone, if you have anything you want to go and look back over, you can. And if anyone missed it, you would let them know. That would be great. So thanks very much, Bryan. Appreciate it.
Thanks very much for having me.
All right. Have a good evening, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.